Rome, the eternal city. For over 2,000 years it has been a blazing banner of the best of civilization, architecture, education, beauty, empire, and war. Many of the marvels of that wondrous age still stand throughout Italy and beyond, as a testament to the greatness of a people who reached the pinnacle of power and stretched the possibilities of human achievement. Their production of commodities like steel and concrete were not to be surpassed until the Industrial Revolution, and they will remain perhaps forever unmatched in certain fields. Such a rare thing it is for a people to simultaneously excel in every single field of human endeavors, from the poetry of Virgil, the architectural theory of Vitruvius, the aqueducts of Frontinus, to the warcraft of Gaius Julius Caesar. The Romans forever changed not only Europe, but the world, and its legacy continues into the present. It's hard to overestimate the impact of the Romans, something which far exceeds their physical imperial presence. But who were these amazing people who accomplished almost unthinkable feats? Who transformed a pastoral village in the hills into the most dynamic power in world history? Who were the Romans? The origins of the Roman people are shrouded in the mists of prehistory, accessible only through linguistics, archaeology, and archaeogenetic studies. The ancient Romans themselves were unsure about their own origins. In the early days of the empire, the poet Virgil set about to glorify their origins, tying Romans to the flight of Aeneas from Troy. Yet there is good reason to believe that this was not the original Roman tale, but one based on Greek rationalizations of their origins. The Greeks had long colonized parts of eastern and southern Italy, and had created their own myths about the origins of the Romans, something Greeks frequently did, such as the idea that the Persians were originated from Perseus. Like with the tales of the gods, some Romans came to adopt this story. Yet there remained a native tale, one of their own origins that could never be fully supplanted, that of Romulus and Remus. The Romans, like many Europeans, can trace the roots of their language and culture back to a group known as the Proto-Indo-Europeans. There's been much debate as to how, when, and where the ancestors of the Proto-Italic language came into the Italian Peninsula. Recent studies have shed increasing light on their early development. Bell Beaker peoples with a relatively high level of steppe ancestry spread throughout Western Europe in an initial wave starting around 2500 BC. As early as 2200 BC, steppe-derived ancestry was appearing in Italy, associated with the Bell Beaker culture. A recent genetic study titled Ancient Genomes reveals structural shifts after the arrival of steppe-related ancestry in the Italian Peninsula by Tina Saupe et al. Has demonstrated that by the early Bronze Age, a significant level of steppe-related ancestry was established in northern Italy. Quote, "When using two putative sources, all the target Bronze Age groups from North and Central Italy presented here support a scenario in which the Chalcolithic-like individuals received a contribution of steppe-related ancestry, possibly through the late Neolithic or Chalcolithic groups from the north, such as German Bell Beaker. However, this isn't the end of the story. Some locations in Italy where the Bell Beaker material culture spread do not seem to have been associated with any significant degree of steppe ancestry. It's evidence that the Bell Beaker settlement was not only moving from north to south, but that they were migrating via boats to whatever locations were more favorable and easily obtained, with the least amount of resistance from existing groups. While in the north, during the early Bronze Age from 2200 to 1750 BC, steppe ancestry represented a significant factor, upwards of 40%, and close to that of Central Europe. They had lighter skin pigmentation, an elevated presence of light hair and eye colors, and were slightly larger in build than the earlier Neolithic inhabitants. However, they did not affect other regions in Italy to the same degree during this early phase. In some regions, the settlers had been relatively small in number versus the local population, and had been absorbed over time. It effectively rules out the idea that Proto-Italic developed throughout Italy during this early period, and points instead to its development in northern Italy, in close contact to those just north of the Alps, which would in time become the Celts. The percentage of steppe ancestry would increase throughout the early and middle Bronze Age, associated with continued migration of people from the north to south, carrying the male haplogroup R1b-L11, a haplogroup found most commonly in Celtic and Germanic people, with its highest concentration today in Britain, Ireland, and northern Spain and Portugal. Steppe-derived individuals from graves in Broium and elsewhere show that male lineage was extremely important to them, and male descendants were being buried in relation to each other. While we can't say with exact certainty when the Proto-Italic language split off from other dialects spoken in Western Europe, we can be fairly certain that its progenitors brought it from the same regions which would, by the later Bronze Age, speak Proto-Celtic. Proto-Celtic and Proto-Italic originated from the same Bell Beaker language grouping and the same populations of Bronze Age Bell Beaker-derived peoples north of the Alps. This common language group is sometimes known as Proto-Italo-Celtic, and it was likely spoken right the way across Western Europe in the early Bronze Age, derived from the dialect of Proto-Indo-Europeans spoken by the Bell Beakers. Of course, this is in reality an oversimplification. There were certainly many other languages that came out of this same grouping, most of which do not survive. One example is Lusitanian, spoken in parts of Portugal into the Roman period. The other may be Veneti, which was spoken in northeastern Italy, also into the historical period. Both languages show close affinity to Celtic and Italic, but seem to group strictly with neither. The affinity between Celtic and Italic can be noticed even by those who are not trained linguists. Even modern Gaelic retains a certain recognizable similarity to Latin, and not via later word borrowings. Classical Latin has vates, and Gaelic fa, seer. Senus, shen, old. Scutum, scia, shield. Deus, dia, God. Luna, luan, moon. Telus, talov, earth. Nebula, nave, sky or heaven. Taurus, tarav, bull. Regina, rien, queen. Rex, ri, king. Vir, fair, man. There are many other such examples, and keep in mind this is a comparison between Latin and modern Scottish Gaelic. Proto-Celtic could likely be mistaken for Proto-Italic by someone who is unfamiliar with either. Both had their roots in the Bell Beaker spread during the early Bronze Age, and both were in close contact during their development. The earliest material culture that likely represents Proto-Italic or Proto-Italo-Celtic is the Polada culture, present across a wide area of northern Italy in the early Bronze Age. However, some archaeologists believe that it is not a direct continuation of the Bell Beaker culture, but represents further migration by Bell Beaker-derived populations from north of the Alps. They frequently built homes upon stilts, often in wet areas. Villages were small, with only a few hundred people, but they show the first evidence for domesticated horses in Italy. Their artifacts show a clear connection with styles north of the Alps. Likely, there was a constant movement of population from north to south all throughout the Bronze Age, leading to a swelling population that would give rise to the terramara culture, starting around 1650 BC around the Po Valley. The terramara culture would continue the earlier Pallada's connection to settlement in wet regions. Population estimates calculated by the archaeological studies suggest that the population expansion of the community far exceeded a natural growth rate, and likely represents persistent and large-scale migration from the north. The period corresponds to the growth of the tumulus culture, the forerunner of the Urnfield and Hallstatt Celts, and it's likely during this period the tumulus was still linguistically pre-Celtic, and thus any migrations from this cultural zone could have contributed to the development of Proto-Italic. These Italo-Celtic peoples built towns near watercourses. They dug extensive trenches around their communities and redirected the water flow, hence the name terramara, meaning land-sea culture. The water would be easily accessible to the community, but also help act as a defensive barrier like a moat. Some practiced cremation and buried weapons alongside the remains, similar to the contemporaneous tumulus culture, while others continued to bury their dead. They also possessed amber, showing their trade connections north of the Alps. They were a highly successful group, almost too successful. The population density became very high, without the technological development, land use knowledge, and urban planning to support it. As later surviving Italian customs demonstrate, when facing overpopulation, groups of young men would be sent out to find new land somewhere else. This process would have been how the Proto-Italic language spread throughout the Italian Peninsula. The Apennine culture still dominated over much of Italy in 1600 BC, including the future site of Rome. Though some have speculated that they were Proto-Italic, it's more likely that those some may have been Proto-Italo-Celtic speakers. Most likely they represent a cultural group associated with the ancestors of the later Etruscans, a group descended from the Neolithic farmers. They would gradually absorb influence and genetics from the incoming Italo-Celts, but things would shift dramatically over the next few hundred years. By 1600 BC, typically classified as the Middle Bronze Age, noticeable amounts of steppe ancestry begins to appear in central Italy. Hundreds of years of gradual migration south by populations from the north. Possibly these bands of youthful warrior settlers took to the wilderness and followed the Apennine mountain range into less densely inhabited regions, and from there established villages in the hills, raided and took the lands which they could gain through force. However, large and organized populations like the Proto-Etruscans were able to withstand these smaller incursions. The Etruscan genetics show that they were absorbing these new settlers, showing that this was not only a one-directional process. In some places, they gained dominance, and in others, they were absorbed. As these movements south were taking place, not all was stable in the north either. Starting around the 13th century BC, there appeared, spreading from north to south, the powerful presence of the Urnfield culture. How much of this was cultural imitation by Proto-Italic peoples who had maintained close connections, and how much may have represented a physical migration is still unknown. However, there was migration of Proto-Celts into northern Italy during the Late Bronze Age. The Canagrate culture, which appeared in the western Po Valley at around this time, originated north of the Alps, appearing suddenly and having little connection to the previous Pallada culture. Their material culture and burial customs were identical to those practiced by the Urnfield Celts. After about a century, they seem to have fused with the inhabitants of Liguria, establishing the Golosecca culture. They acted as a trading bridge between the Etruscans and the Hallstatt Celts, and are believed to have given rise to the historical Ligurians, who are identified by ancient Romans and Greeks as being Celto-Ligurians, due to the similarities of their culture and language with that of the Gauls. but they likely also gave rise to the Leponti, who are known for the Lepontic language inscriptions identified as a Celtic language separate from that of Gaulish, developed in northern Italy from Proto-Celtic. Based on the available evidence, what may have taken place is that Urnfield groups pushed south and conquered and mixed with the existing Proto-Italic peoples living in northern Italy. These people adopted the Urnfield culture, and in keeping with the expansionist nature of this culture, began to conquer regions throughout central and southern Italy, under the banner of what is termed the Proto-Villanovan culture. It was during the spread of this cultural group that Proto-Italic gained dominance throughout central and southern Italy. Despite the sparse archaeological evidence, this migration was unlikely to have been entirely peaceful. Similar events recorded within the historical period certainly were not. Young men sworn to the god Mars would wander through the woods, guided by the deity, to the land of an unsuspecting tribe, howling like wolves, dressed as wolves, acting as wolves. They would beset them by night. Like Romulus, they would steal the women of nearby tribes to help establish their new domains. If they were successful, some of their kin from back home would move there to join them. If they failed, they would end up as corpses in the wild, or would themselves be absorbed by other non-Italic groups. A few hundred years of such activity spread the Proto-Italic language and the Urnfield culture throughout much of Italy. The elites of the Proto-Villanovans, like those of Urnfield, wore splendid breastplates and helmets of shining bronze, were cremated and buried in urns along with their most treasured weapons and jewelry. They built their settlements on hills surrounded by fortifications and practiced agro-pastoralism. In other words, they began almost exactly like Rome. A 2019 genetic study of the remains of a Proto-Villanovan woman showed her to be of haplogroup U5A2b, a female haplogroup common to North, Central, and Eastern Europe. She carried around 40% steppe ancestry, a level consistent with that of Central Europe, and shows that females were also migrating alongside with males. Yet the Proto-Italic peoples didn't gain dominance in all of Italy. After the disappearance of the terramara culture and the appearance of Urnfield Celts in the north, by the historical period, northern Italy was either inhabited by Celts or speakers of languages closely related to Italic and Celtic, but strictly fell into neither language group. It's thus quite possible that Proto-Italic only fully cemented in the form that we recognize after the migration. The Etruscans were another significant population that was not conquered by this influx, and yet they were highly influenced by it. Genetic studies of the Etruscans during the Iron Age showed that they possessed between 20 and 30% steppe ancestry, and that they had fully adopted the Urnfield culture. By 900 BC, they can be identified as the Villanovan culture, as distinguished from the earlier Proto-Villanovans. Yet despite their mixing with those of steppe ancestry, a Neolithic farmer elite had retained political control, keeping the core of their language and their unique ethnic religion. They were not the only ones either. The Pyrrhic people, dwelling in the northeast of Italy and the Alps, seem to have likewise spoken a language related to Etruscan into the historical period. Likely they had existed in the lowlands earlier, but were forced into the mountains by incoming invaders. At the dawn of the Iron Age, Italy was a culturally and linguistically diverse place, though genetically it had become fairly uniform. Rome is in fact much older than its own myths assume. Evidence for settlement begins in the Middle Bronze Age, and it was probably during the spread of the Proto-Villanovan culture that a formal settlement was established on the Palatine Hill. Settlements were organized by clans or extended families who would elect a leader called a rex, king, in a similar way as was recorded of Iron Age Germanic peoples or Celts. One's family status was important, But kings did not automatically pass on their position to children. An assembly of elders made the final decisions on such things. This was the origin of the Roman Senate, from Senux Atus, the Council of the Elders. The tripartite division of the social class appears to have also closely followed Celtic examples recorded by later Roman and Greek writers. Patricians, plebeians, and slaves. While the workings of the later Roman kingship and Roman Republic were quite formalized and arcane in respects, they had their roots in Bronze Age tribal organization of Indo-European derived communities. But something dramatic happened near the start of the Iron Age, which significantly changed the Italic peoples forever. While Rome was still but a very small town upon the Palatine Hill, massive numbers of ships began to arrive on the southern shores. Armed men disembarked, racing like wolves of Apollo over the forests and fens, felling those who stood in their way, and swearing to the skies the name of Zeus. The Greeks established many and extensive colonies throughout Italy, and their presence was a massive influence on everyone in the peninsula. Their art and architecture, their philosophies, but also organizational principles, military advancements, and religion. They also gave to the region an early version of Greek writing. Latin, Lepontic, and Etruscan peoples would quickly take it up and begin to write in the early 7th century. In fact, Greek settlement in parts of Italy appears to have taken place as early as the Mycenaean period, and archaeological evidence from pottery shows that there was Greek cultural influence even in the Bronze Age. However, this dramatically increased with the settlements of the 8th century onward. Sybaris, the modern town of Sibari, was the most populous of the Greek settlements of Magna Graecia, but Tarentum, Callipolis, Cumae, Syracuse, and many others were significant, equal or larger to many cities in Greece, estimated to have had populations of tens if not hundreds of thousands. Had they been politically united, they would have transformed all of Italy into a Greek-speaking nation. But they were as likely to go to war with each other as with the Italic peoples. At some point in Roman prehistory, knowledge of their own myths was largely lost. They were almost entirely replaced by those of the Greeks. Perhaps it was a famine or plague, or perhaps even a type of iconoclasm that decided the old myths were no longer fit for purpose. Whatever it was, nearly all the myths of the Roman gods are just a copy of the Greek ones, though we know that, for instance, Mars is not actually the equivalent of Greek Ares, and archaically likely has more in common with Apollo. But the gods are mashed together to fit a formulaic equation. The loss of this native mythology was a serious blow to the Roman religion, and though it has some of the best preserved knowledge of rituals, it lost myths that can only now be scraped out from other stories like that of the founding of Rome, where an original mythology of the cosmos may have been transmuted into the foundation of the city. In addition to the Greeks, the Phoenicians also had expanded into Sicily and Sardinia, and were a major factor in trade throughout the Mediterranean, and would in time be a major rival to the rising Roman power. But the large Greek influence and the rivalry between Italic and Greeks explains in part the different course of development of the Italic peoples into such a strong cultural and military force. In order for Rome to survive, surrounded by so many nearby rivals, it required strong minds, strong will, and a strong fighting potential. And from some of the most advanced civilizations of the time, they were able to absorb new ideas. By 753, the classically derived date for the foundation of Rome, a Proto-Italic town had already been there since the Proto-Villanovan period. By the Iron Age, their language would have taken on regional characteristics, transforming into what is now called Old Latin. One example of this language is the Carmen Cellaria, which invokes mamars. There are also several inscriptions on various artifacts. If they wrote extensively during this period, however, nothing is preserved. The Palatine Hill was the most culturally significant place in the city and the focus of the city cult of Romulus and Remus and the Lupercal Cave. The hill was also the site of Heracles defeating Cacus, and the site of the cult of Faunus. The name of the hill is likewise also significant. Some have suggested that it comes from Etruscan phalat, meaning sky or heaven. However, it might just as probably be related to the Latin word palus, meaning a stake, prop, or post. In the myth of the founding of the city, when Romulus is constructing the walls, he calls upon Jupiter, Mars, and Vestra to protect the area. Remus, in this account, unaware of the boundaries, mistakenly crosses them and is struck dead by Keller, one of Romulus's followers, for having violated the sacred bounds. The festival of the Peleis is related to this event and the city's founding on April 21st, with elements of the festival very similar to that of Beltane, of the Gaels, including the practice of driving animals between fires to cleanse them. Famously, the lowland surrounding the Palatine Hill was swampy and had to be drained before the city could expand, one of the first major civil projects of Roman history. Though the biggest site, communities developed on many hills in the nearby area. Eventually, as the population expanded, these communities would come together as a single entity, the 7 hills of Rome later encompassed within the city walls. Rome was located in a favorable position. Plenty of water from the Tiber, defensive hills, nearby access to the sea without being close enough to draw pirates. It was said that Rome was named for Romulus, its glorious founder, a shepherd turned king, a true son of Mars. While the story reflects true Roman tradition, the name is almost certainly based on the settlement and not the other way around. Likely it comes from Proto-Indo-European sru, meaning a flow, and could have referred to or been an archaic name for the Tiber. In their origin tales, the Romans recognized that they were related to other Italic peoples. This would have been obvious to them based on the customs and languages. Though by the historical period the Italic peoples had developed a number of different languages, such as Umbrian, Oscan, and Latin, they were still similar enough to be recognizably connected, and have some degree of mutual intelligibility. Though the mythical origins of Rome itself began with Romulus and his brother, they were of Latin origins through their mother, the daughter of King Numitor of Alba Longa, a descendant of Latinus, son of Faunus, son of Picus, who, according to many accounts, was a son of Mars. Picus was the leader of the first Latin tribe and was transformed into a woodpecker, one of the sacred birds of Mars, who played an important role in his cult related to augury, and in the ver sacrum, a ritual expulsion of young men, or sometimes animals, who were dedicated to Mars and sent from towns and cities who were facing extreme hardships. Faunus was likewise a minor god related to pastoral activities, divination, and boundaries, equated later with Greek Pan. Thus, the Latins generally saw themselves as descendants of Mars, and the Romans re-emphasized this connection in their own particular myth. While there are several different accounts, the most famous and the one with the most genuine mythological content said that Mars, descending in dark clouds, impregnated Ilia Silva, daughter of King Numitor, and a maiden sworn as a keeper of the sacred fire of Vestra. Her uncle Amulius had overthrown her father, and saw her sons as a threat to his rule. An oracle had predicted that he would be killed by his grandnephews. He ordered them to be killed, drowned in the Tiber, but they were abandoned along the river under a fig tree, saved by the god of the river himself, and taken under the care of a she-wolf, while a woodpecker brought them food. They are later found by the herdsman Faustulus, who raised them with his wife Larentia. When they are grown, they learn the truth, muster their supporters, and depose their great-uncle, restoring their grandfather to the throne. However, later they must leave the city, taking the criminals and other volunteers with them to found a new town. They establish it upon the Palatine Hill, when they were establishing the walls. Although accounts vary as to exactly how this happens, Remus is killed. He is buried in what would be marked out as near the center of the city, with the walls built up all around him. Though mythical, the tale may preserve a real tradition that saw the city founded by a band of youths dedicated to the god Mars and expelled from a nearby community during times of hardship. It was an Italic custom that survived into the historical period. However, the structure and many details are clearly drawn from an earlier, purely mythological tale, likely one which concerns the creation not of the city, but of the world itself. I did a documentary investigation into this myth if you're interested in more details. Romulus was said to have established many of the major traditions in the city, the military, and many of the city's social organizations. Two different versions are told of his demise. One account says that when he was inspecting his troops on the Campus Martius, a sudden storm swept up and he disappeared, never to be seen again, likely carried off to heaven by his father Mars. Another account says that he was murdered by the Senate and torn to pieces, with each piece of him being buried in a part of the city, similar to how the world is formed from the divided body of Ymir. After the death of Romulus, the Senate held power for a year, alternating power between them. Finally, the second king, Numa, was elected. He was in many ways the opposite of Romulus. A priest and a peacemaker, he established the guilds and the villages of Rome, encouraged agriculture, and obtained the blessing of the gods. Following him was Tullus Hostilius, said to have ruled between 674 and 640, and as his name suggests, he pursued war. Until Tullus, Rome was said to have been a part of what was known as the Latin League, organized and led by the town of Alba Longa. Tullus is said to have destroyed Alba Longa. This violated the protection of Jupiter Latiaris, who ultimately killed Tullus with a lightning bolt, though not before the king had commissioned and constructed the original Senate House, the Curia Hostilia. Around the same period ascribed to the rule of Tullus, the marshy land between the hills in Rome was being drained, and the Roman Forum was beginning to take shape. The Forum Boarium shows signs of already being in use for trade, and as the name suggests, it would first have been used for the trading of cattle, bull, the staple form of movable wealth in pre-currency European society. The Regia, the house of the king, and later of the Rex Sacrorum, a priestly office that took over the sacral duties that had previously belonged to the tribal kingship. The next king was Ancus Marcius, ruling from 640 to 616. He fought off attacks by the Latin League, and launched a counterattack that expanded Roman borders and drew the populations of the defeated into Rome. He founded the port of Ostia, built the first prison, and won battles against the Sabines. When he died of natural causes, perhaps the most successful king since Romulus would be elected by the people, Lucius Tarquinius Priscus. Tarquin the Elder, as he is most frequently called, is evidence of the dynamic relation that existed in Rome around the 6th century. He was not of Roman origin, but was born in Tarquini, an Etruscan city. Yet he was not fully Etruscan himself. His father was Demaratus, a Greek trader from Corinth, who had settled in Tarquini for commercial reasons, and had become quite wealthy in the lucrative trade between Greece and Etruria. Yet his son had political ambitions, which the constitution of Tarquini would not allow him to fulfill. He could not obtain public office, because he was not an Etruscan by blood. He therefore moved to Rome, used his great wealth to increase his public profile, and won the favor of King Ancus, who gave him charge of his own children. Tarquin the Elder would wage successful war against many of the Latins. He likewise fought tough battles against the Etruscans, eventually subduing a number of their cities and carrying off great amounts of plunder. Beyond wars, he was credited with the creation of the Circus Maximus, and was the first to celebrate a Roman triumph. He was also credited with the introduction of a number of Etruscan customs, such as the kingly scepter, the fasces used by the lictors, and other rank-distinguishing garments. Even the tuba, originally a military horn. Whether any of these things were actually introduced by him, or were even Etruscan in origin, is hard to say. Similar legendary introductions of garments and items can be seen in other pseudo-historical records, such as those of Ireland, and are likely more legendary than real. Regardless of how successful his rule may have been, the sons of Ancus thought he cheated them out of what should have been theirs. The king was killed by a flying axe in a riot that was stirred up by them, but his wife Tanaquil hid his death. She knew who should be the next king, and she plotted to make it happen. Servius had been brought to the palace of Tarquin when he was young. His father had been a warrior who had been killed in fighting against Tarquin as the town was conquered. However, there were other accounts. Legend said that his mother, a Vestal virgin, had been impregnated by a spirit which came to her out of the flames, Vulcan. Queen Tanaquil had seen him with a halo of fire when he was young, and omens had told her that he was meant to be king. When he came of age, he married the daughter of Tarquin the Elder, and upon the king's death, the queen made sure to arrange for Servius to take power. Unlike other kings, he was not elected by the Senate. Servius's birth from fire and his fire halo may have some relation to real Roman history unfolding during his supposed reign. Although the legendary history of Rome would suggest that the Temple of Vestra was constructed under the reign of Numa, archaeological evidence suggests that it was built in the 6th century, during the supposed time of the rule of Servius. It's possible that Servius also publicly claimed to be the son of Vulcan, which was the origin of the legend of his birth from fire. Relying on his popularity among the masses as opposed to the aristocracy, he established the first census and organized the Comitia Centuriata as a central legislative body. However, this would earn him the hatred of the city's wealthy and powerful. Servius had 2 daughters, both named Tullia, and had them both marry the sons, or more likely grandsons, of Tarquin the Elder, Lucius Tarquinius, and his brother Aruns. Yet Lucius was not satisfied, and the jealous whisperings of the younger Tullia convinced him that he should seek to overthrow her father. He went to the Senate House with his cohort and denounced Servius as a low-born scoundrel who favored the poor rather than the elite. Servius heard this and went to the Senate to confront him. Lucius threw him down the stairs, and his goons murdered him in the street. Tullia, the daughter that nobody would ever want, drove her chariot over the body of her father. The cruel murder of the popular Servius by his son-in-law would lay the moral groundwork for the massive change that was to come, the casting down of the kings, and the foundation of the Republic. Under the tyrannical rule of Tarquin the Younger, his son raped Lucretia, the wife of Lucius Tarquinius Colentinus, supposedly the son of Aruns Tarquinius. She informed her family of the rape and killed herself. Collatinus and his father-in-law went to the people to report the crime, and gained massive support, including the aid of Lucius Junius Brutus, the nephew of the king. Brutus, in his official role as tribune of the Celeres, called a meeting of the Comitia. He outlined the many crimes of the king, and the long list of grievances and convinced the people to remove the right to rule and send him into exile, which they did, though not without a fight. The king would attempt to retake the city, attempts which failed. Brutus would fall in the fight, but he would live to see the last king of Rome. The ordeal left a vacuum in Rome, which would develop into the Republic, governed by rotating dual consuls, until the rise of Gaius Julius Caesar some 400 years later. Rome had been formed from tribal roots, but as it expanded in population and wealth, inequalities began to likewise grow and cause social tensions. Early Indo-European societies were always hierarchical, and the Italic peoples were no different. But within a relatively small tribe, the wealth and power differentials were not extreme. As societies grow larger, those differentials increase to dramatic proportions. By the end of the 6th century, Rome had burgeoned into one of the largest cities in Italy, and it had an elite to match, able to expend massive amounts of wealth on temple construction, elaborate burials, and mansions. They would use that wealth, as Tarquin had done, to influence the political outcomes. The romantic notion of an aristocratic council of wise elders sitting around a fire in a small hut, electing a king from among the most worthy people in the village, was being transformed into a tightly knit plutocracy. There may have been a growing sense that the position of the king was a danger to their own power. Servius had, after all, used his power as king to curtail that of the wealthy, to reveal their assets to the public, and even to confiscate some of their wealth. A figure who could rally that kind of public support, and with the legitimacy of sacred tradition, was a threat to the elite. The transition from kingship to republic did in no way mean Rome was less warlike. If anything, the opposite seems to have been the case. The republic was birthed in blood and baptized in war. No sooner had the king been banished than he gathered the Latin tribes, angry with Rome after the recent treaty Rome had signed with Carthage that claimed Latin territory as their own, and the forces of Tarquin's son-in-law, the tyrant of Tusculum, tried to retake the city by force. In the Battle of Lake Regillus, the twin gods, interpreted as Castor and Pollux under Greek influence, appeared in battle, aiding the Roman troops, who, under the leadership of Postumius, carried the day. The Latins then signed a treaty with Rome that promised to provide aid in conflicts with external enemies. It would mark the serious beginning of the incorporation of all of Latinum into Rome. But it was not a swift process. Over the next 100 years, there would be numerous battles with the nearby groups such as the Sabines, Aqui, Volsci, but especially the Etruscans of the city of Veii. The city attacked Rome in what became known as the Fabian Wars between 483 and 474, where the Etruscans were dealt a defeat, but not eliminated. The Romans would remember, and in 396 they besieged Veii, tunneling under its walls and conquering the city. The survivors were enslaved, the city repopulated with Romans. It was the first major territorial achievement through war. The year 390 would live in infamy among the Romans, who for hundreds of years would nurse the memory, bringing ever to their tongues the iron taste of defeat. The Celts of the Po Valley, under the leadership of Brennus, king of the Senones, had a meeting with some Roman ambassadors. When they were negotiating with the Senones, a fight broke out, and the Roman ambassadors killed a Senones aristocrat. Rome had committed a grave violation of diplomatic rules, and the Senones decided that they would deal a punishment to them for it. They sent their own ambassadors to Rome and demanded that the Fabian brothers, who were responsible for the murder, be handed over to them so that they could deal out retribution. Rome refused, as the brothers were from a very powerful family, and instead had them elected as military tribunes. Furious, the Celts decided on a course of war. As they marched through central Italy, people fled behind their walls in fear, but the Celts were said to shout as they marched, to fear them not, for their destination was Rome. While the exact size of the armies involved are highly disputed by historians, the Senones did march south through Etruscan and Umbrian territory to reach Rome seemingly unopposed. Their speed of movement took the Romans completely by surprise, and they had only mustered a force typical for one of their more accustomed campaigns. The two armies met where the Tiber River met the Allia Brook. Roman forces were disorganized and unprepared. They were quickly routed by the advancing Celts and fled or drowned in the river. When the Celts reached the city, everyone was thunderstruck. All able-bodied men rushed to hold out on the Capitoline Hill. They tried to evacuate artifacts before the Celts broke down the gates and ransacked the city. But according to Diodorus Siculus' account, they didn't murder anyone. The Celts reportedly tried for several days to take the Capitoline Hill, without success. With both sides fatigued and suffering sickness, the Romans agreed to pay a ransom of 1,000 pounds of gold. When they complained that the Celts were cheating them by using heavier weights, Brennus threw his sword upon the scales and declared proudly, "Vae victis, woe to the conquered." However, when they left the city with the gold, it is said that they were soon waylaid by a relieving army from Veii and defeated. How much of this story is actually true is hard to say, but it seems certain that the Celts did sack the city. Beyond that, the details are hazy at best. The event left a lasting mental scar on the thinking of the Roman elite, and played a role in their later desire to conquer Gaul. In the immediate aftermath, other nearby adversaries tried to take advantage of Rome's weakened state. Over the next 30 years, Rome would be in almost constant war with the Etruscans and the Latin League, though the fighting concluded with peace when a Celtic army marched south. Marauding bands of Celts would be a relatively frequent event from that time onward, and would be greatly feared by the Romans. In 343, the Samnites, a rival Italic group, tried to seize the fertile plains held by the Romans. They were defeated, but Rome was unable to follow up with a counterattack, for at that very moment, the Latin tribes again rebelled against Roman leadership in what's known as the Latin Wars. It would be the last time they would do so. When Rome defeated them, many of the towns were Romanized, transformed into Roman colonies, or put under direct Roman rule. It was the largest expansion of Roman territory up to that point, but further expansion would be paid in much blood. They faced a peer and rival in the Samnites, every bit as organized and militant as they. The Second Samnite War would break out again in 327, and fierce fighting would last for the next 23 years. But this wasn't even the end of it. For though defeated and forced to sign a treaty that handed over large amounts of land to the Romans, the Samnites rose up again in 298 and dealt the Romans a stunning defeat. Following this, the Samnites sent embassies to many of the other peoples of the Italian Peninsula, Celts, Etruscans, and Umbrians. Now was their chance to defeat Rome once and for all. Against their combined forces, the Romans could not hold. The armies of the Allies and the armies of Rome faced off on the plains of Sentinum. The Celts on the right, the Samnites on the left. Roman cavalry, led by Publius Decius, attempted to break the Senena cavalry, but were defeated when the Celts unleashed their chariots. Then it was the fierce Celts who charged, their thundering chariots leading the way, smashing the Roman lines, followed by their swift infantry and those ferried along on the chariots. When the situation looked most dire for the Romans, Decius gave himself as a votive to the gods, throwing himself wildly into the combat to inspire his men to hold the line. He fell, but his line managed to regroup and hold on. But on the left hand, the Samnites were outflanked by the cavalry of Quintus Fabius. They broke and fled past the Celtic lines. The Senones, realizing the danger but refusing to break, formed a testudo and tried to hold on. But the Samnites kept running, allowing Fabius and his men to destroy their camp and cut off any retreat. Rome carried the day, and the Celts, embittered, broke their alliance with the Samnites the following morning. Though there would be several other battles waged against the Samnites after Sentinum, it was all downhill. The end of the war would see them totally capitulate. Rome, through war and through treaties, had now gained control of much of central and part of southern Italy. The Greeks of Italy watched with unease as Roman power seemed to multiply exponentially before their eyes, and began to fear that they would be the next targets. The Greek city of Tarentum, which following the defeat of the Samnites now bordered on Roman-held territory, was especially concerned. They requested that Pyrrhus, king of Epirus, aid them in war against the Romans. He agreed, assembling a formidable army, including war elephants. He is the origin of the phrase Pyrrhic victory, for though he was winning battle after battle against the legions of Rome, his losses were immense in victory, and the Roman manpower supply seemed endless. He was reported to have said, "If we are victorious in one more battle against the Romans, we shall be utterly ruined." In the Battle of Heraclea in 280, the Romans were close to being totally crushed. They were heavily oppressed by the war elephants, which nullified their cavalry and terrified their troops. Routed and forced to retreat, the cavalry of Pyrrhus was sent after them to finish them off. However, one of the injured elephants panicked and threw everything into chaos, preventing the chase. Perhaps a single elephant changed the fate of the world. Feeling less than enthusiastic about fighting the Romans, Pyrrhus instead turned his attention to Sicily, aiding the Greek states there in their war against Carthage, which was striving to gain control of the island. However, when things turned into a mess there too, he returned to Italy in 275, upon the request of the Samnites, who were still wanting to rebel and fight back against Rome. But he was defeated, and he returned to Greece. He died in 272, and in that same year the Romans would capture Tarentum, and the rest of the Greek city-states in the region would submit, extending Roman power to the southern tip of the peninsula. In 100 years, Rome had transformed from a middling city-state, one of many in Italy, to the single greatest force not only in Italy, but the entire region. By around 260, the Etruscans, Umbrians, Samnites, and the Greek city-states of the southern peninsula had come under their power. Yet they were not only fighting wars this whole time, but making strides in civil engineering, building roads and aqueducts and many temples to the gods. Their fertility rate must have been sky high, able to reproduce enough not only to furnish the army and labor force, but to establish a myriad of colonies everywhere they gained a foothold. Consider that because infant mortality was so high in the ancient world, it's thought that to maintain the population levels it would have required at a minimum 4.5 children per woman just to maintain the population. Roman women must have been having at least 7 children on average. Alongside this, there were civil changes happening in Rome. Public offices opened up for plebeians as well as patricians, allowing for greater social mobility and creating a new expanded nobility within the city. Up to this point, however, Rome had not expanded past its natural surroundings in Italy, but as it turned its eyes on future lucrative places to expand, it would set things in motion that would undo the very fabric of its successful society. Carthage had played a large role in the Western Mediterranean for hundreds of years. They operated a lucrative trading empire, with many colonies throughout North Africa, southern Iberia, Corsica, Sardinia, and increasingly, Sicily. The two expansionist powers were destined to meet. The war between them began over the city of Messina. A band of Italic warriors, who called themselves the Mamertines after Mars, had seized control of the city while Rome was fighting against Tarentum. Forces from Syracuse were trying to take the city, but Carthage allied with the Mamertines and stationed a garrison of their own troops there to support them. But the Mamertines and the Roman Senate were divided in opinion on this, neither feeling very comfortable with the Carthaginians being there. Rome decided to dispatch troops to support the Mamertines against the Greeks of Syracuse and tell the Carthaginians they could beat it. When the Roman troops arrived, the Carthaginians were perhaps rudely expelled from the city. Offended, they then blockaded Messina. Both sides sent more troops, and it quickly spiraled into an all-out war for the conquest of Sicily. Things were not going well for the Carthaginians, until one of their commanders was replaced by Hamilcar Barca. He would lead the troops in Sicily for the duration of the war, and be a notably competent commander, though he would be later overshadowed by his son. The Romans soon found that they were completely overmatched at sea, and set about trying to create a naval force on the fly, doing what Romans did best, copying others and making the process more efficient. They copied chainmail from the Celts, and they would copy the shipbuilding techniques of the Carthaginians and use them against them. Using these new ships, Marcus Atilius Regulus sailed across to North Africa to try and strike Carthage on home soil. He defeated the surprised Phoenicians and seized the city of Tunis, but was later captured and some say tortured to death. For 15 years after this heroic attempt, the war waged on. Eventually, due in part to the Numidian betrayal of Carthage, they agreed to abandon Sicily to the Romans. A few years later, Rome would demand Sardinia and Corsica be handed over as well to avoid war. The weakened Carthage felt it had no choice but to comply at the time, still dealing with the Numidian threat. Yet Hamilcar Barca's son, Hannibal, was now of age and looking to get revenge. He built a power base in Iberia to fuel his war aims, then convinced the rulers of Syracuse and many of the other southern Greek cities in Italy to join him in a rebellion against Rome in 218, initiating the Second Punic War. His defeat would see large portions of Iberia and northern Italy was under Roman control. It seemed Rome was unstoppable. No sooner had they defeated Carthage than they were intervening in Greece and warring in the east against the Seleucids. By 146 BC, they conquered and annexed all of Greece. It was during this period that Rome gradually, and then not so gradually, began to change. It had developed into a Mediterranean power, and it was bringing in many slaves. On top of this, many were also choosing to migrate to Rome to seek opportunities. This was changing the ethnic and genetic characteristics of Rome itself, and giving rise to social problems in the process. The recent genetic studies were able to conclude that Rome, and Italy generally during the Iron Age, were genetically similar to the Celts of southern Gaul or Iberia. But it also found something else. The closer in time to the foundation of the Roman Empire, the higher the amount of people whose origins were very different. While we don't know the exact timeline for this dramatic ethnic replacement, it wouldn't have happened overnight, but over several hundred years. This seems to have affected Rome specifically, while northern regions remained more consistent. while Rome annexed many territories such as Spain and Gaul with large populations. Yet almost all the immigration before the late Empire seems to have come from the eastern Mediterranean and North Africa. The most famous voices of this anger felt by the average traditional Roman citizen were Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. They were plebeian tribunates in 133 and 122, best known for calling for the distribution of lands to poor farmers. However, their concerns were triggered by the massive influx of people into Rome. They also wished to extend citizenship rights to Italian allied peoples, with the idea that this would decrease the flow of peoples into the city. This would eventually happen, but only in conclusion to the devastating social war of 91 to 87 that saw Italy descend into what amounted to a civil war, which ended with the distribution of citizenship rights, or Latin rights, to most of the peoples of Italy. Working in concert with them was Marcus Junius Pennus, elected plebeian tribune in 126. He passed a motion to expel all foreigners from the city. A similar law was again taken up by Gaius Papius, plebeian tribune in 65, which expelled all foreigners and punished people who had wrongly assumed Roman citizenship. One thing that they all had in common is that they were plebeian tribunes. They were representatives of what you would call the common people, rather than the elite. Cicero, who almost always represented the elite view in every matter, responded to these views in his De Officiis, written around 44 BC, saying, "They too do wrong, who would debar foreigners from enjoying the advantages of their city, and would exclude them from its borders, as was done by Pennus in the time of our fathers, and in recent times by Papius. It may not be right, of course, for one who is not a citizen to exercise the rights and privileges of citizenship, and the law on this point was secured by two of our wisest consuls, Crassus and Scaevola. Still, to debar foreigners from enjoying the advantages of the city is altogether contrary to the laws of humanity." And it isn't the only such quote from him. In Pro Balbus he says, "And without any dispute, that has been the most solid foundation of our empire, and the thing which has above all others increased the renown of the Roman name, that the first man, the creator of this city, Romulus, taught by the treaty which he made with the Sabines, that it was expedient to increase the population of this city by the adoption of even enemies as citizens, and in compliance with his authority, and with the precedent which he established, the presentation of the freedom of our city to others has never been interrupted by our ancestors. Therefore many tribes from Latium, the people of Tusculum, the people of Lanuvium, and all other peoples of all other races have been received into the privileges of our city." Later population movements in the Migration period and the Middle Ages would see the genetics of Italy shift back toward their Iron Age ancestors, due in part to further north to south migrations by Germanic populations. But by the time of the Roman Empire, Rome was undergoing a rapid ethnic change that had an effect on the culture and likely the politics. Possibly this even contributed to the downfall of the Republic and the rise of Caesarism. The Roman identity under the empire would change dramatically, detach completely from its ethnic roots, and yet it would retain some semblance of continuity. Greeks and others under the Eastern Roman Empire referred to themselves as Romans, something that continued through the Middle Ages despite having no connection to the city or even Italy. Even the medieval Germans wished to revive the memory of Rome, the cultural identity of the city that its people gave birth to, became something transcendent, which gained the respect and sparked the imaginations of many. Well, I hope you liked the video, and if you did, please like, share, and subscribe. consider supporting me on Patreon, PayPal, or through YouTube Super Stickers, or become a member of the channel. I would like to give a big thanks to all of my supporters. And as always, stand tall.